Dr. Sara Manning Peskin, welcome to Shrink Wrap Radio.
Thanks, David. Thanks so much for having me. It's very exciting.
Well, I'm really glad to have you because speaking of exciting, you've written a pretty exciting book. Among your many accomplishments, you've written the 2022 book. So is it out yet?
It's coming out on February 8th.
Okay,
So
good.
about
So
a
we're
week and a
going
half.
to foreshadowing it. Yeah, but by the time this goes up, it'll be just a day or two away. And the title of this book is A Molecule from Madness, which is really intriguing, Tales of the Hijacked Mind. And I love that title. What was the inspiration behind this book?
So I wanted to capture what it's like to live with these catastrophic diseases of the mind that are caused by a particular type of molecule. And then I also wanted to be sort of a bit of an entertainer in talking about the scientists who figured out how these diseases work. And in a lot of cases, figured out how to cure them.
Wow. Yes. Yeah, both of those are fascinating. I love those anecdotes, and feel free to throw in the discussion any examples that come to mind of either a case or a historical person that seems important. I've only got one or two questions like that. So we're only a molecule away from madness, but I have to ask you, what is a molecule?
It's a great question.
I'm out of my depth already.
So it's a great question. My husband is not in medicine, so I always use him as a good measure for which words do people know what they mean, and which words are sort of used, but people aren't really sure in particular what the meaning is. And so what a molecule is a group of atoms that are bound together. So then you probably are saying, well, what the heck's an atom? And an atom is
okay, go ahead.
It's things that you've heard of. So something like hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, those are all atoms. And when you link them together, that creates a molecule.
Yeah. And what is it about the molecule that makes it so powerful, that it can drive us crazy?
So it's a great question, and a question that people have been asking for years. And each of these molecules fits into something else or some sort of larger system that it essentially jams. And that's how each of these problems arise. Okay. So whether the molecule is a stretch of DNA that's been mutated and then creates something that doesn't work correctly, whether it's a protein that is supposed to protect us from invaders and instead actually attacks our own minds, or maybe it's what's called a small molecule, so much smaller than DNA, smaller than proteins, and either it's invading the brain where it's not supposed to be there, or on the other side, sometimes there are small molecules that we're supposed to have around to function, and they're conspicuously absent.
Well, you mentioned DNA. What's the relationship between DNA and a molecule? I would have thought that, let's see, and a cell, I guess. So I would assume that every cell has DNA in it. But are the molecules in the cell?
Yeah, so it's a great thought. How do all these terms actually relate to each other? So DNA is really the biggest molecule that we have in our body. It's enormous. It's gigantic. To the point where we actually have some microscopes that they're special microscopes, but they can even see DNA and see the structure of DNA. That's recent, but it's just a huge molecule. And DNA is the molecule that essentially carries our genetic information. And the relationship between DNA and proteins, turns out, is that our DNA is sort of like a computer code. And then what our body does is it reads that code and it creates something called RNA, which is a relative of DNA. And then our body reads the RNA and creates something called proteins. And the proteins are really the workhorse of the body. So they're the ones that actually perform most of the job of staying alive. The DNA is sort of the rule book, but the players really are the proteins.
Wow, that's really fascinating. I actually failed chemistry as an undergraduate.
I'll be honest, I failed my first biochemistry test too. So you're in good company.
Yeah, they told me after I was getting really low grades. I had not had any chemistry in high school, so I was really at a disadvantage against most of the rest of the class. Seemed to have already had a good introduction to chemistry, and so I made the mistake of dropping out because I didn't even have to take it. I needed some kind of some little science element that was needed, I think, and write it before I could graduate. And later the TA came up. I ran into him on the street or something, and he said, "Hey, you haven't been coming to class. What happened?" I said, I stopped coming. My grades were so low, I just dropped out." He said, "Oh, you probably had a solid D. You should have just kept coming." I would have been really happy with that D because I ended up having to go to summer school to make up for that. So much for my my scientific life.
It's a rough topic. I remember our organic chemistry teacher was known for, he would write with one hand and erase with the other hand. And, that was how fast the class would move.
Oh man, yeah, no, I'm glad I missed that one. And so other new terms for me, molecular neurology is a term you use. So what is molecular neurology?
Yeah, so that's sort of the forefront of, at least of, cognitive neurology right now. So the idea is that when we think of something like dementia, it's actually not a sort of abstract term. There are many different causes of dementia, and we define them based on the molecules that are associated with them.
Okay.
So you can have 6 different people with dementia, but what's going on under a microscope in their brains at a sort of molecular level can be different in each person.
Yeah.
And so our focus now is really when someone comes in with memory or thinking or behavior problems, our first goal is to figure out what molecule is causing the problem. What molecule do we expect to see under a microscope? And then from there, how can we design treatments that treat that specific person? And that's a approach that oncologists, so cancer doctors, have been using for years and have been very successful. We've struggled with it in cognitive neurology, but we're starting to make headway. And that's really the future of treating these memory, thinking, behavior disorders, is treating the molecules that are causing them and realizing that they are different in each person.
And you used another term that was new to me, although it's probably self-explanatory, cognitive neurology. So we've got molecular neurology and cognitive neurology. And, I'm familiar with cognition and theories of cognition and so on, which have to do with thinking, the thinking part of our mind.
Yeah, so cognitive neurology is essentially neurologists who focus on the study of memory and thinking and behavior. So folks who come to see us are coming in saying, I can't remember words anymore, or, I'm having trouble reading. And someone told me it's not my eyes. Could it be something else? Or, they're coming and their relative is saying, this isn't the person that I married. They're going up to strangers. They're saying inappropriate things. What's wrong with them? And those are the types of symptoms that we see in our patients.
Now, I know you're a neurologist. Are you also a psychiatrist?
I'm not. We in the fellowship we do some geriatric psychiatry, and our the behavioral neurology boards have some psychiatry and some neurology, but no, I didn't do a psychiatry residency by any means.
Okay, so you're primarily a scientist. Do you also do some treatment or not?
So most of the diseases that we treat don't have cures. So we have medications that we use to help manage the symptoms, but most of the syndromes that I see in my clinic don't have a FDA approved cure.
So that I took note of that when I was reading your book, and it caused me to wonder, well, what keeps you going? I mean, you're working in a field where there are no cures for the most part. That sounds like a discouraging place to be. How do you keep yourself revved up?
I think there are different ways to look at it. You could say, wouldn't it be great to just treat broken arms all day because you can fix all of them? On the other hand, you could say, well, there is, to say there's nothing we can do for you because there's no cure is I think problematic. I actually feel like there is a lot that we do for our patients. The relationships that we develop with them, I think, are helpful and fulfilling, actually,
Sure.
on both ends.
Yeah.
But I think on a lot of levels. So on the one hand, we have people who come in with really rare types of cognitive issues, something like, I feel totally normal, but I notice that every time I walk around, I keep bumping into things on my left side. Or, my husband, was such a wonderful and caring person, and lately he seems to have had affairs and he's gambling, and everyone's telling me that it's a mental health crisis, but is it something more? So there's all these sort of unusual symptoms, and it's very validating for people to hear that this is caused by some sort of organic brain disease.
Yeah. So it's
And
not
also
their
that
moral, not
go
a
ahead.
moral flaw that they have.
Exactly. Yeah. It's not that the person suddenly, it doesn't like you anymore. There's a molecular problem, something out of their control is going on in their brain.
Yeah.
And it's helpful not only because it explains that the person doesn't have as much control over the problem as you might think, but it also helps because we can tell people, this is what we think will happen in the future. These are the symptoms to watch out for. This is what to plan for. This is how fast it tends to progress. So that's one piece. And the other piece is that part of what we do is enroll people in research studies to try to find a cure for these diseases. And so we're not, if nobody sees these patients, we're never going to figure out how to treat them.
Well, I would think too, part of the answer to what keeps you motivated is you're on the scientific frontier. You are, you have the opportunity to be involved in major discoveries that will have a big impact down the road.
I think it's a great point that you bring up, that it's easier to see these types of conditions in a place where there are lots of research resources, because it's much easier to talk about these things when we say, look at this research opportunity where you can participate in finding a cure. So I think that's a fantastic point that you bring up.
Yeah. Have you had a chance yet to make a significant discovery or
Well,
finding?
I will say on a personal level, I actually started off as a MD PhD student, and my initial plan was to actually run a lab. And then I made a bit of an abrupt turn a year into the PhD, and went back, finished medical school, and now I mostly do physician writing. So my sort of place that I've found is more writing about these conditions and sort of spreading the word. And then I do some clinical research where I see patients as part of these research studies, but I'm not anymore at the sort of on the bench top using a pipette and petri dishes and growing vats of bacteria anymore.
Okay. One question that I had, not knowing that part of the answer, was if there was a historical figure that whose work inspires you to keep going.
I will say in the character in the book that I felt most sort of excitement about was Joseph Goldberger, who he was the scientist who did most of the work for figuring out what was going on with pellagra. So he was essentially, so pellagra is this disease that causes a very sort of grotesque, disfiguring rash. It causes dementia and it causes terrible diarrhea. And in the early 1900s in the southeastern United States, there was this huge epidemic of just hundreds of thousands of people coming down with this disease, and it was horribly deathly, and nobody could figure out what was causing it or how to fix it. And they end up calling on Joseph Goldberger, and he's this guy who he was born in the Carpathian Mountains, came to the US at age 9, speaking very little English, grew up working at his dad's bodega, essentially delivering groceries. And there was this lore that he would hide books under his jacket. So he would go and deliver the groceries, stop and do a little bit of reading, go back. And he eventually works his way up, goes to medical school, and tries to sort of hang a shingle and can't make enough money. He was making like, it was $10 or $20 a month, which today was something like $400 a month. So not enough to survive on. So he says, okay, I'm going to go join the public health service. And he goes all over the country. He goes outside the country. He contracts yellow fever, typhus, typhoid as part of these studies. So he's really in the mix with the research, and then eventually gets called on to solve pellagra and figure out what's going on. And he decides in the end that he thinks that pellagra is caused by a vitamin deficiency.
That was the connection I was making. Yeah, I must have heard that somewhere along the way.
Exactly. Yeah. So yeah, and he turns out he died before he proved exactly which vitamin was missing. But he did these incredible experiments. He at one point did the dominant theory at the time was that pellagra was caused by an infection. So he said, I don't think it's caused by an infection. I'm going to go so far as to try to infect myself with this disease to prove that it's not infectious. And so he ate stool, he mixed it with urine, he ate flakes from patients' rashes. It was just these dramatic, stomach churning experiments that he did on himself. And actually that his wife volunteered to participate in some of them. But so he just sort of pushed these theories to the limit for what he believed in. And so he's sort of the one that I always just felt like he was just this amazing scientist, and he got nominated for Nobel Prizes and never won.
Huh, wow. Yeah, interesting chapter there. You identify 4 classes of molecules that have the ability to hijack our brains, as the subtitle of your book talks about. And you describe them as mutants, rebels, invaders, and evaders. So maybe we can kind of step through them. In your mutants chapter, you discuss DNA and its role in Huntington's disease, which is just a horrible disease, and you describe it and bring that horror is clear in your writing. And it just so happens that you also write about the breakthrough work of Nancy Wexler, who I knew in graduate school. So yeah, and she's become such a major figure. And she was, I think my wife, as I was talking with my wife about it, I think my wife got to know her a little better than I did. I think I was friends with her boyfriend at the time, who was in clinical psych. And so my wife was aware even then that Nancy's mother had Huntington's, and that she was concerned that she had a 50-50 chance, I guess, to get this dreaded disease. And fortunately, she came from a family with money and a psychologist father who was very successful. And so she was able to marshal all sorts of research that was a breakthrough. So anything you want to add to that story? I'm kind of telling a bunch of it just because I had this
That's so neat
personal.
that you knew her.
Yeah,
What else do
yeah.
you remember about your interactions?
Well, as I say, I was friends with her boyfriend, and she was, I don't know if you remember those days. And there's the person you're going out with, and they've got their friends, and you've got your friends, and the spouse uh, or partner of the other person isn't as always interesting to you, so as interesting. So I never really got to know her that well. I was more into, I knew her boyfriend, who I think his name was Ken Winter. Now I know she later got married. I don't know if she married Ken Winter though.
I don't recall the name of her husband. I don't think that's what it is,
I don't
but I
think
don't
so
recall.
either. Yeah, but actually my wife showed me, we went online and she showed me that Nancy is alive and well, and um, and kind of like Michael. She appeared like Michael. I'm gonna block on his name now, who has Parkinson's. Uh,
Michael J. Fox,
Thank you, Michael J. Fox. And so she has those kind of movements, in her head and upper body. That was all I could see in the video. Cognitively, she's really clear still.
So yeah, it's a great point. So she talked for a long time about being at risk, and she created really the science that we use now to test people for the gene that causes Huntington's disease. So you have thousands of people out there who have been tested for Huntington's disease without having any symptoms. They've been tested for the gene that causes the disease, and that's only possible because of the research that she did. But she actually chose not to get the test.
Yeah,
Uh,
that was remarkable.
and then eventually, very recently, there was an article written in the New York Times about her where she talked about talking about having the disease. Until then, you can look back at videos and see that she starts to have those abnormal movements that you talked about. But she wasn't talking about having the disease. And she would sort of have some sort of evasive answers when people would ask her. But then more recently, she's talked about that she does have the disease.
Other coinky dinky is she has a sister, Alice Wexler, who came to Sonoma State University, where I was a professor at the time. And but I didn't get to know her. And she was just there for a short period of time, but
Yeah, she's
kind
so
of
I actually interviewed Alice as part of the research for the book. And she's wonderful. And she's written these two beautiful books, one of which is about her own family history. And the other is about the history of Huntington's disease, which is a fascinating history.
But Alice didn't get it, right?
No. Yeah, so they sort of follow the statistical explanation of or expectation, where there are two people or two kids, and one of them has it and one of them doesn't.
Yeah, yeah, amazing. So let's see, Huntington. Now going back to the DNA that you were talking about, there's a factoid in the book that really blew my mind, that where you say that the DNA in your body could reach the sun and back many times over. That's just hard to believe, that there's something packed so tightly there.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing the way that our body. I think we often think of DNA as a computer code, and that's it, where it's sort of two-dimensional. But actually, it's very much a three-dimensional molecule, and the way that it's wrapped changes over time. So areas can be more open and then more closed, and that affects which proteins we end up creating.
Yeah. So Huntington's was an example of the mutator, right?
Exactly.
And So another one that's in that same class that you mentioned is Alzheimer's. So that's the similarity between the two. What's the difference, though, between Huntington's and Alzheimer's? What's that relationship, and where does it diverge?
Yeah, so it's a great question. So Huntington's disease is caused by an abnormality in a particular gene, which we call the Huntington gene. And Alzheimer's disease actually usually is not caused by a single genetic change. So the vast majority of people with Alzheimer's disease, I can't point to a particular place in their DNA where something went wrong. So that's sort of a very early difference between them, aside from the fact that the symptoms themselves are quite different. And the cause really is different as well. With Alzheimer's disease, we think of genetics in sort of two groups. So there are very, very rare cases of Alzheimer's disease that are caused by a change in a particular gene, not the Huntington's gene, but usually one of three other genes. Those are extraordinarily uncommon and tend to cause Alzheimer's disease in people's 40s and 50s. And that's actually the type of Alzheimer's disease that I wrote about in the book, because even though it's uncommon, it actually may hold the answer to curing the disease. The more common kind of Alzheimer's disease that starts in people's 70s tends to be less genetic. And in some cases, you can have what's called risk genes, where these are 20, 30 or more genes, where if you have a certain variation of the gene, your risk of Alzheimer's disease may be a bit higher, but it's nothing like the black and white genetics of Huntington's disease, where if you have a certain number of what's called repeats, or if you have a certain form of this gene, if you live long enough, you're definitely going to get the disease. So Alzheimer's disease genetics is just a little bit different, a little bit more fuzzy, and a little more difficult to predict, which is part of why it's so difficult for us to find a treatment.
Yeah, some people have, am I right? And I think I remember that some people are speculating that it may be more of a spectrum type disorder. Does that ring a bell or not?
Tell me a little more.
Well, I may just be off the wall, so let's not spend a bunch of time on it.
Maybe it's possible also that you're completely right, and it's very possible, or very likely, I should say.
Okay. So the risk of being a generalist is that there are all these things floating around that aren't all that together precise in my mind. Now, one of the other categories of molecules that hijack our mind that you talk about are what you call rebellious proteins. Tell us a little bit about that, and what would be one or more examples of the disease that would result.
Yeah, so proteins are these, I guess we talked about these complex molecular machines, and they're the molecules that actually do most of the work of keeping us alive. But sometimes they can actually turn on us. And so the categories that I used for these proteins, some of them are proteins that are built to attack invaders. They're called antibodies. But our body makes a mistake and actually starts producing antibodies that actually attack ourselves or attack the brain. So that's one type of disease that I wrote about. And then there are another type of disease that's caused by proteins, where it's caused by the protein misfolding. So proteins are these elaborate, people actually have called them robots. They're sort of these elaborate structures, and they work in part because they have a particular formation. But as soon as they lose that formation, they can actually start aggregating, or essentially clogging our brains. And that can cause catastrophic, really, problems.
What sort of symptoms would present that would get you to thinking in that direction?
So some of those diseases are things like mad cow disease, which was a big problem in England a long time ago. There's a disease called Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, which is relatively rare, but is very rapidly progressive and uniformly deadly. that's caused by that type of process, where it's a protein that misfolds, and then it actually causes lots of other proteins to misfold. So it sort of recruits followers, and it's just extraordinarily toxic to the brain.
If we drink a lot of protein shakes, does that increase the probability of, of a problem?
So it doesn't seem to be so much a problem of too much protein, but more a problem of misfolded protein.
Okay.
So it's bad proteins rather than too much proteins.
Okay. Then you've got these other two categories, evaders and invaders. So let's talk about evaders first. Tell us a bit about that.
Yeah, so the idea of evaders, it didn't even exist until not that long ago. But it's this idea that the brain actually requires certain molecules in order to be able to work. And the best example of this is vitamins. And so many of the vitamins and supplements that people take are totally unnecessary. On the other hand, if you're actually deficient in some of the vitamins, it certainly can cause symptoms. And pellagra, which was that epidemic in the early 1900s in the southeastern US, that was caused by a vitamin deficiency. It turned out
Vitamin C, right? Was it vitamin C?
it was called vitamin B3, so
Oh,
niacin.
okay.
And
Okay.
it turns out after all of that research that actually they could cure it for about 10 cents. Basically, I think it's something like $1.80 in today's money. So it
Yeah.
actually had this very cheap cure. It just took so long to find it.
Yeah. And then what are the invaders? The idea of an invader somehow seems a lot more familiar to us. You know, when we get sick, we tend to think that we've been invaded by some germ.
Yeah, so we think often of invaders being germs or things like that. I sort of used it more for things like medications, and I think that's something that the vast majority of people take some sort of prescribed medication at some point, and we often don't really think about how these medications affect our identities and affect our personalities.
Oh.
And so, yeah, the part that I wrote about in the book was this idea, this theory that Abraham Lincoln might have suffered from mercury toxicity. There's a lot of evidence that he took a medication called blue mass that was mostly mercury, and that was the active ingredient. And there's actually even a quote from someone that he knew saying that Lincoln told him that he stopped taking blue mass shortly after getting elected to the presidency because he thought it made him cross. So there's this idea that, could this incredible president actually have suffered from a dangerous medication side effect and somehow had the insight to say, that doesn't suit me, I'm going to stop using that.
Yeah, well, I've reached the age where I'm on a lot of different medications and and you read the possible side effects, and they're very alarming. The ones that are heavily advertised on TV, and
there are so many of them. It's
yeah,
impossible to take any medication if you don't want any risk of side effects.
that's what
that
I'm
comes up often
discovering.
For us.
Yeah.
It comes up often for us in clinic, and what I often tell patients is, here are the most common side effects. Here's the top 5 side effects,
Yeah.
but anything can really do anything. So if you notice something, let us know. Because it's a little bit of a tight line to walk. In some cases, when you tell people that this medication can cause something, they are more likely to notice that symptom. And so you worry about, people looking out for side effects and noticing them, even if they wouldn't have noticed them otherwise. On the other hand, you want to be open if people are having side effects to addressing them or stopping medications.
I'm under the impression that one of the frontiers of medicine is that it would become much more individualized, to somehow tailor it to a given person's body. How far away are we from that? Of course, there are all these other catastrophes that may befall us before we get there, but
it's a great question. I think that's exactly the right question to ask for cognitive neurologists. And in some ways, we've made these incredible strides. So if you take Alzheimer's disease, so, what is Alzheimer's disease? What did Dr. Alzheimer actually discover in the early 1900s? He looked at the brain of someone who had memory loss, and he saw two structures. One was we now think of as called plaques. They're made of a protein called amyloid. Another one we think of as tangles. They look like sort of pieces of spaghetti inside of neurons. We know now that's caused by a protein called tau. So that's what defines Alzheimer's disease: amyloid and tau proteins building up in the brain. For the longest time, we were totally unable to figure out who actually had that unless they had already died. We had to look at their brain under a microscope.
Yeah.
But now we actually have the tools in someone who's alive to figure out, do they have elevated amyloid? Do they have elevated tau while they're living? So we can actually define the molecular signatures of their disease without ever opening up their skulls or without them passing away. So we've actually made these incredible strides in individualized medicine. This was a huge problem before, where we were enrolling all these people in drug studies for Alzheimer's disease, and it turned out many of them didn't actually have Alzheimer's disease. We just couldn't figure it out. But
So
now we can.
Is it a blood test?
The test I'm thinking of is what's called a PET scan. So they essentially have people come in, they give them a injection of a tracer that sticks to amyloid or sticks to tau, and then they take a picture of the brain and they figure out, where did the tracer go?
Yeah, remind me what PET scan stands for. What's the PET?
So the PET scan, essentially each of these tracers has a radioactive tag. And so when you take the picture, you figure out where is that radioactive tag located.
Yeah, but what does PET stand for?
It's called positron emission topography.
Of course.
But to be honest, I couldn't tell you exactly what each of those words mean.
Okay.
So I can fill in the blanks, but I can't really fill in the blanks.
Yeah. Now, you mentioned that your work now has moved a lot towards writing, like as illustrated in this book, and I'm sure you must be aware of Oliver Sacks, and the man who wrote the book, The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat, and others. Incredible author and so on. Do you feel any kinship with him and what he was doing? Is that the kind of writer that you see yourself wanting to be?
Yeah, I would say that I would be embarrassed to even do any sort of comparison, but he really created this field. He's the first one who started writing about patients with cognitive changes, and he sort of broke the whole thing open. He really established this entire practice. And when I was trying to write the book, I tried to use him as a model for how do you tell the narrative of neurological illness, because he does such a beautiful job of describing particular patients' diseases. And then he moves on more towards the sort of philosophy of it. And then I sort of move on more towards the medical history. And for that, I tried to use Siddhartha Mukherjee as more of a model. He's the one who wrote The Emperor of All Maladies, Gene. He's a beautiful storyteller, and he does an impeccable job telling the tales of scientists and bringing them to life. But Oliver Sacks really broke this entire thing open. He established the field, essentially.
Yeah, definitely. So what is the most common misconception that people have about how our brains work? And what do you want people to take away from your work and your book?
The most common misconception has to do with the difference between Alzheimer's disease and dementia. And that's, I would say, 80% of the patients that come into our clinic ask that question. And the answer has to do with what each of the terms is describing. So dementia is a description for how someone functions in the everyday world. So what it means is that they have difficulty with complex activities that they can't do. So they can't drive, they can't grocery shop, they can't cook, things like that, because of memory and thinking problems. That's what dementia means. And then there are lots of different causes of that, but dementia, the word itself, just reflects that memory and thinking problems have become severe enough that someone can't do those activities. Alzheimer's disease is a description of what's going on at a molecular microscopic level. What it means is there's buildup of amyloid and tau proteins in the brain. So what it turns out is that most cases of dementia are caused by Alzheimer's disease. So about 60 to 70% of people with dementia, if you look under a microscope, you'll find amyloid and tau.
Yeah.
That being said, about 30 to 40% of people who have dementia, actually, if you look under a microscope, you're not going to find amyloid and tau. You're going to find other proteins that are causing the problem. And on the flip side of that is we have those tools to pick up amyloid and tau in the brain in living people. And we've actually found that there are some people who have amyloid and tau in the brain, but are totally normal. And
I've heard that.
So you can have Alzheimer's disease without dementia, and you can have dementia without Alzheimer's disease. Dementia, again, is how do you function in the everyday real life world, and Alzheimer's disease is what's going on under a microscope. So that's, at least from our practice, that's the question that comes up the most often.
How can you have Alzheimer's without the tangles and plaques?
So to have Alzheimer's disease, you have to have the tangles and plaques. But you can have, you have to have the tangles and plaques, or the tau and amyloid proteins. But you can have those proteins and actually be cognitively normal. We find some people who are like that.
They have enough maybe reserve capacity or something in their brain.
So that's right. That's one theory. Is that what's going on?
Yeah. Well, is there anything else that we should touch on before we bring this to an end?
So I think the only last piece I would say is, what do I want people to take away from the book, which is, I think, the question you asked that I neglected to answer.
Yeah.
And my goal was really to impart sort of two viewpoints. One being, the brain is the most complex machine known to humankind, and yet it has these Achilles heels where we can be totally overwhelmed. Our personalities, our identities can be destroyed by these single particular molecules. On the other hand, I wanted people to get a sense of resilience. You could say, look at all these ways we can fail. On the other hand, most of us do just fine. All of the diseases that I wrote about, most of us will never have. The average 65-year-old will go the rest of their life without getting dementia. And so I also wanted to give a sense of awe for how resilient the brain is, and also that sort of added benefit of medical invention, where not only is our brains resilient, but we also are sort of standing on the shoulders of giants, where we've had these medical heroes who have figured out how to cure many of these diseases. So I mostly wanted to give people a sense of shock and awe, I guess.
Okay, that's great. Well, Dr. Sara Manning Peskin, I want to thank you for being my guest today on Shrink Wrap Radio.
Thank you so much for having me. This was a real treat, David, and I really appreciate it.